All right, well, my clock says we're on the hour, so welcome everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Denise Ellsworth. Welcome to Pollinators in the City, our speaker series running every day this week from 10 to 11 Eastern. I'm in the OSU Department of Entomology and Department of Extension, where I head pollinator education for the state. So excited to be hosting this week's webinar. If you've been with us all week, you were enlightened by Reed Johnson's talk on Monday, talking about where honeybees are foraging in urban, suburban, and rural areas. Gerardo Camillo yesterday talking about those certifications in St. Louis and some really practical ideas, what's happening there with those habitat enhancements. He referred a lot to some of the research that Mary's been undertaking, Mary Gardiner, our speaker today. And so we're excited to have her talk about her vacant lot property project in Cleveland that ran for 5 years, a really large study with some interesting findings. Scott McIver tomorrow will be talking about green infrastructure, so green roofs and green walls, community gardens, and other constructed spaces in urban areas. Do they matter? And then winding up our week on Friday, Damon Hall talking about some of those policy initiatives. How can we, besides doing actions in our own yards and in our communities, what kind of policy actions are needed to protect and enhance pollinator spaces? So a nice week for us. All of these sessions will be recorded and posted on our webpage. The address is up there on the screen on the top left, the go.osu.edu/pollinators in the city. All those recordings are also posted on YouTube and they'll remain there indefinitely. So I have folks ask me, do I leave them only for a couple of weeks? We just leave them up there. So if you have some past ones that you'd like to go back to or something that you've missed, we'll have those recordings up there. So joining me to help with this webinar, again, our faithful facilitator, Marcia Karsten, Xerces ambassador, and Ohio State University volunteer pollinator specialist. Marcia, I always appreciate your help here. She's got all her bees and pollinator paraphernalia behind her, so appreciate your help with all of these webinars, Marcia. Our format this morning, we go for about 60 minutes. I let the presenter go ahead and present at a comfortable pace the content, their core content, and then we take about 10 minutes or 15, depending on how many questions we have. So we do use the Q&A box for questions. We have the upvote turned on. So if you see a question that you want to have answered, do an upvote to that. That'll help the question rise to the top. And as I said, we'll post a few questions for Mary once the core seminar is over. I do want to mention our funders. We get support from the USDA NEFA Integrated Pest Management Grant for Pollinator Health, which helps to fund this and other webinars. So appreciate that USDA funding. We do have a live transcription feature. That's kind of a new thing to me on Zoom. So it is on your control bar. That'll toggle on and off. If you don't want that transcription, you can just turn it off. You can also click and drag on the transcription. If it's at a place on your screen that you don't prefer, you can move that out of the way. All right, so at this point, I'd like to introduce Mary Gardiner, who is a member of the Dijon faculty here in the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University, where she has a heavy teaching load, also some great research program, and then is also involved in a lot of extension work. So you may have known her through the Buckeye Lady Beetle Blitz, a statewide survey of lady beetles. Early in her tenure here at OSU, also pollination investigators, another community science project. She's the author of Good Garden Bugs and lots of fact sheets here at OSU, focusing on natural enemies. And today she'll be talking about her 5-year study of vacant lots in Cleveland with some really interesting practical ideas that we can all take home to vacant properties or wild spaces close to us. So Mary, let me turn this over to you. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Denise. And Marcia, thanks you guys all for being here. I really appreciate these opportunities that the webinars offer us to meet so many of you guys from all over the US and from around the world to talk about bee conservation. It's an awesome opportunity for me to share my research. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to be, as Denise mentioned, let's see, live transcript. I'm going to cancel that out. 1 second here. Okay. So as Denise mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about a large research project that I conducted in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, focused on vacant land as insect habitat. And we're going to talk about some of the values that those habitats have and also the challenges that come up when you're trying to manage these spaces as insect habitat. So first I want to introduce myself. Denise kind of went over some of this, but I'm a professor of entomology here at Ohio State, and the majority of my appointment is research. My lab studies the ecology of urban green spaces. We have some projects focused on those habitat certification programs that were discussed yesterday, as well as on the ecology of vacant land. So I mostly work in sites that either are currently residential habitat or were residential habitat and are now vacant spaces. I'm focused a lot on how we as conservation practitioners can design those habitats and manage them to better the quality of the urban environment for insects. We look a lot at both like local habitats as well as the larger landscape and how that might be influencing the value of a habitat for insects. And a real important focus that I've gotten into more recently is the effect of pollution on the quality of urban environments for biodiversity. And I'm going to talk about that some in my seminar today. And this is my current lab. It happens to be all female at this point, which is just funny. This is the first time in my 20-year career that I've had all female grad students, but it's exciting to see all these young women getting interested in STEM careers. So here we are on our current mode of lab meetings, the fun Zoom time. So hopefully we can have some more in-person lab meetings in the coming year. And in addition to mentoring these students, I do, as Denise mentioned, do some extension work. So I focus a lot on Master Gardiner programming and also 4-H and some of the products that Denise already mentioned. And as she said, I also do teach several classes. Right now I'm teaching grant writing, which is really, really important for students coming up in a STEM career. I also teach insect ecology and presentation skills. So because I teach presentation skills, hopefully this won't be a terrible webinar, right? I should be pretty good at this by this point. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about the value of urban green spaces for bees, specifically vacant lots. And when people think about bees, of course, the general public is first going to think about the honeybee, and many people are shocked to learn that the state of Ohio alone has 500 bee species. And what is even more surprising to me is that 20% of these, so 1 in 5 bee species, live in these small vacant habitats in cities. So these habitats support a large proportion, about 20% of our state's fauna. And that is about 107 bee species that I have documented in Cleveland. So who are some of these bees that we find in Cleveland? Before I get into the data that we've collected, I just want to overview what I'm talking about when I say Ohio's bees. So there are a number of different types of bee functional groups that live in Ohio vacant lots. So first are bumblebees. We find several species of bumblebees living in cities. These are social bees where there's a queen and workers who work together to manage the development of the next generation. So here, if you were to, this is a frozen colony from a research experiment we did. So if you were to be able to see into what's going on in a bumblebee colony, these are all workers that were tending, developing offspring that are in these closed cells, and also filling these honey pots with nectar and pollen resources to feed those developing larvae. So you have in a bumblebee colony a queen and several workers who provision a nest. Interestingly, with bumblebees compared to honeybees, only the queens overwinter. So at this time of year, the queens are overwintering, and in the spring, you will see these very large bumblebees out very early starting new nests, and those are the queen bumblebees that will start the next generation. They nest in the ground, and there are, as many of you probably know, several rare and threatened species of bumblebees. So the fact that they live in cities and that there's several rare species makes these a real conservation focus for a lot of urban research. There are also the majority of bees that we find in Ohio are solitary bees. This means that each female provisions her own nest. They don't work cooperatively like bumblebees do. These solitary bees include both native and non-native species. And it's an important thing to note when you're talking to those who are not, already really focused on bee conservation, that these solitary bees are not aggressive. They're not going to pose a risk to people. And so when talking to people about providing bee habitat, I think this is a really important thing. And among the solitary bees, we have species that are very common, that people will often find in their gardens, to species that are very rare. And Agapostum and Melisodes and Osmia are some common genera that you'll find here in Ohio cities. So within the solitary bees, these bees make their lives in really different ways. So one major group are the miners. These are bees that nest in the soil. So they dig holes and they raise their young underground. And many of them have very specific soil requirements. So they will only nest in very particular types of soils, which oftentimes we might not have a lot of in urban areas. So you often see fewer soil nesting species in cities versus rural places because of that. There are also carpenter bees. So many of you are probably familiar with the large carpenter bees, Xylocopa. These are large bees that nest in wood. So they will make a tunnel nest in wood. And you can see a really cute picture of one coming out here, and also a picture of the tunnel. They provision that nest with pollen and nectar for their developing larvae. But there are also small carpenter bees that nest in pithy stems. And you can see here this Ceratina going back to a pithy stem, and here working to carve out a hole for the developing bees that are coming out. There are also many types of bees that nest in cavities. So if you put out those bee boxes for bees, you're attracting these species to those houses. So two common genera are Osmia and Megachile. Osmia utilize mud that they collect to make their nest cells inside cavities. So they will separate each developing larva and its provision with a mud barrier. And you can see that here. And these not only nest, in the cavities we put out for them, but in nature, they would nest in any sort of cavities they could find. It could be tree bark, it could be old beetle burrows or abandoned insect burrows of some type, things like that. Megachile are the leafcutter bees, and they use cut leaves to make their nest cells. So instead of using those mud provisions, they separate each cell with leaf material. Here you can see one carrying a rolled up leaf back to a cavity. And here is a picture of a bee cutting that. They have very large mandibles for cutting those leaf pieces. So all of these bee species find their way to make a living somewhere in nature, right? And some have very specific requirements, and some are more general in what they need to get by. And when we think about cities, we think about cities making it more difficult for many of these bees to make their living, right? So when we urbanize, we take away many of the resources that animals use in their day-to-day life in order to reproduce and survive. And so typically you would predict that with urbanization, you have a decline in the species diversity of bees that you would find in an area. And that is due to many factors. One major factor being habitat fragmentation. When we build, we're taking away natural habitat, we're making that habitat more disparate, more disconnected, and also of a lower quality. And so the prediction would be that you would have fewer species and a higher proportion of exotic species like this Carter bee, and more species that are generalist in what they need. So species that will feed on a lot of flowers that they might happen upon, species that don't have specific nesting requirements, etc. But bees don't always get the memo that urbanization is supposed to reduce species diversity. So in some cases, if we look at this gradient from rural areas into very developed downtown areas, sometimes people have found that bee communities are of a greater species richness and bee abundance outside the city, as you would predict. But in other cases, people have found that as you move into a city, the urban areas are actually more diverse and have more bee abundance, or that the populations remain unchanged. And so why might this be? Well, urban areas, just like any kind of habitat, are not synonymous. There's much variation in what urban areas offer for pollinators, how they're established, what sorts of flower resources there are, how much green space is there. And so just like any ecosystem, there's a lot of factors that are going to influence how what the level of bee diversity is within an urban area, how supportive is the urban environment for pollinators. And from city to city, there's tons of variation. So I've been really focused over the last several years on the potential of shrinking cities to be a hotspot for bee diversity. Shrinking cities are unique in that instead of becoming more urbanized and dense, they are losing population and removing infrastructure, creating more green space. So across the world, there are 450 cities that are losing population. And one of them is Cleveland, Ohio, which is located here in Northeast Ohio. Cleveland was once the 5th largest city in the United States, but it's lost 50% of its peak population. And in downtown areas, there are many houses where people are no longer living. Those houses have, many have been torn down, others have been condemned and are waiting to be taken down by the city. These are in very low income communities where across the neighborhoods where we've worked, just about 40%, 36% of families are below the poverty line of $23,000 a year in income, in household income. And this scenario is not unique to Cleveland. In Northeast Ohio, or in Ohio in general, there are several cities that are losing population, including Toledo, Dayton, and Cincinnati. And across the region in what was formerly a very heavy manufacturing and mining area, there are several shrinking cities present. So this is a picture showing the outline of downtown Cleveland, of the city of Cleveland in gray. And all of the areas that are in red are vacant lots. And so you can see that there are a large number of vacant lots. There are actually over 30,000 lots in the city of Cleveland that are vacant. And many of these are considered permanently vacated, meaning that it's very unlikely that development will occur in the near future. And so this has really reshaped the amount of green space present in the city. So historically in Cleveland, green space preservation was mainly focused on parkland, and those park areas, including metro parks and city parks, are shown in green. And so if you look at that and the red areas, the rise in vacancy has really reshaped the amount of green space present in Cleveland. And this is particularly true on the east side of downtown. So downtown is like right here, and this is blown up here to show just the sheer number of vacant lots. And so on the ground, this is some photos of what it looks like in some of the neighborhoods where there's a lot of vacancy. So you have a lot of standing foreclosure that's been boarded up. These are homes that are fallen into disrepair. No one's living here. And these homes are waiting to be taken down by the city. Some of them might be resold, but most of them end up being demolished. And so this is what the demolishing process looks like. And then following that, the debris is taken off the site. A fescue grass seed mix is planted. And what grows in these lots is a mix of grasses and early successional vegetation, normally known as weeds. So these flowering plants are things like chicory, Queen Anne's lace, red clover, white clover, and the lots are mown once a month. So in between the mowings, you have quite tall urban spontaneous vegetation with lots of blooms, as you can see in these pictures. And so because there's so many flowers, I became very interested in whether or not these weedy habitats might be important bee habitat in the city. So we asked the question, can vacant lots be valuable bee habitat? And we were interested in creating bee habitats that would support the needs of bees, so their dispersal, foraging, and nesting needs, but also meet the aesthetic, safety, and the values of the neighbors that live surrounding these vacant lots. You can see in the one photo, there are a couple houses looking at this flowering vacant lot. And so whatever we were going to do to these vacant lots had to be done in a way that met the needs and values of the community that surrounded the sites. So I investigated this major question over a 7-year project that was funded by the National Science Foundation that established the Cleveland Pocket Prairie Project. This project was a citywide field experiment where we investigated alternative strategies for vacant lot management to support bees and other beneficial insects. This occurred on 40 lots. So at one point I was managing 40 different vacant lots across Cleveland, and we were looking at several treatments. I'm going to talk about 4 of those today. We had a control vacant lot. The control vacant lot was the sites I just showed you. So we were following the city protocols, mowing the lots once per month and just allowing everything to grow that was naturally there. We also had a meadow treatment. So in a lot of the literature, there is a discussion of, if you mow less frequently, the habitat is better for biodiversity. So in those meadow sites, we left the same vegetation that was there. We just only mowed it at the end of the season in October. It stayed growing the rest of the season. We also wanted to investigate planting bee habitat that was recommended for pollinators. And so we looked at 2 strategies. So one strategy is flowering lawns. You see a lot of people interested in flowering lawns. So we planted a turf grass with low growing non-native flowering species. And then we also planted a native habitat that we called a pocket prairie. This pocket prairie included native grasses and also flowering wildflowers that were native to the state of Ohio. So I'm going to show you some pictures of our treatment. So here's the control lot. So that was mowed once a month following the city protocol. And this is the meadow at the end of the season. So you can see it's quite tall. It has some milkweed and flowers, and it became quite grass dominated as well. I wonder if I can hide this. Hide floating meeting controls. There we go. Oops, what did I do? Oh, there we go. And here is the flowering lawn and the pocket prairie. So the flowering lawn was a non-native, low-growing habitat with flowers and grass. The pocket prairie is tall with native wildflowers and native grasses. So what were the steps to establish these planting treatments? I know many of you are interested in establishing habitats like this, so I wanted to include some of the background on how we did this. So the first thing is that I did not do this. So if you are going to plant a vacant lot or field or other conservation space that is very publicly visible, where it needs to be right from the start, I highly suggest going with a native plant producer to do your seed development, mix development, and the actual establishment. Somebody that really knows how to do this in an urban area, because the soil in an urban area is compacted. It might need amendments. It might need tillage. It has a heavy weed dominance in the seed bank. It's a challenging environment to work in from a native plant standpoint. And so I didn't want to do this myself. And so I worked with Ohio Prairie Nursery, who did a great job. So the way that they prepared these sites, we had tremendous weed pressure. And so we herbicided the vacant lots 3 times before we planted. And the goal of that was to try to reduce the weeds enough that it would give the native plants a chance to take over. We then tilled the sites lightly and incorporated compost and micronutrients before we planted. And then we broadcast seeded the sites in the fall. We also broadcast, so that was both the native plants and the non-native flowering lawn. So the same procedure was done for both of those sites. The flowering lawn was supposed to be a no-mow throughout the season, but we ended up mowing it once per month every summer that we sampled it. The pocket prairie, we did end up mowing it once a month the first year to aid in the establishment, because when you seed a prairie, the first year the plants are in the rosette phase. Well, what ended up coming up around them were all of the weedy plants. And so we were cutting those down once a month to try to give the native plants more of a hold and to reduce the seed flow of weeds back into the seed bank. After that first year, we cut the prairie once per year in the fall. Obviously, you're not going to burn a prairie in this scenario, so we cut it in October. and left the debris in the site. So the first question I had when I was doing this is, are we even going to get treatments to sample? Are these plants going to establish? So here in 2014 is the site where we had the pocket prairie right after we seeded it and put straw over the top. And it took until 2017, so 3 years later, growing seasons later, did we actually see bloom of the prairie. So you have to be very patient with this, which can be challenging when people are disappointed that it looks weedy and doesn't look like something different and unique that they expected right away. But we eventually did get a really nice bloom of our pocket prairie. But not everything we planted in either the flowering lawn seed mix or the pocket prairie actually bloomed under the urban soil conditions that we had. So first I want to talk about our flowering lawn. So this is the flowering lawn seed mix that we use. It's called Fleur de Lawn seed mix. And it had all of these different grasses and flowering plants in it. But what we really ended up seeing, so we did see all of these plants bloom. So here you can see the baby blue eyes, the daisy, there's some yarrow and clover here and white clover here. These all started off being quite diverse in the first year, but over the course of several years, they became very clover dominated. So I think that's important to note when you're prescribing this to someone that, you know, might want a really diverse habitat, that depending on the conditions, it may start off that way. At least in our cases, all of the sites became very clover dominated. So we had a lot of white clover and strawberry clover by years 4 and 5. With our pocket prairie, we established a large number of different recommended plants. These are all plants that are recommended to support pollinators. Of these, only a subset were found at all, and of them, some smaller number were very abundant. So in this second box, the plants that are shown in bold were the plants that were found in the majority of my lots. The ones that are all listed, including blue vervain, Riddle's goldenrod, sweet Joe pieweed, those were found in some of the lots, but not all of them. So you can see that we had a subset. So moving forward, if I was going to do this again, I would recommend that people maybe save money and focus on seeding with just these species, since they, out of, you know, the several lots that I seeded across the city, they really did well. The other thing about an urban prairie is it's going to have weeds in it. You're not burning it, you're mowing it at the end of the season. And so from a marketing standpoint, it's really, really important that people understand in the community that this will be a beautiful flowering habitat and it will have all sorts of flowers, but some of those flowers are going to be weeds like clover and Queen Anne's lace. You're not going to be able to eliminate those in a pocket prairie. So here's some pictures of some of the plants that did really well in the pocket prairie. It's kind of nice to look at these flowers this time of year, but they were really beautiful habitats. And here's a picture of what it looked like in the site with all of these plants mixed together. And you can see there in the foreground some chicory and Queen Anne's lace mixed in. So I think it really adds beauty, honestly, to the site. And those plants are resources for bees. But as I said, it's important for people to understand that this is what it's going to look like. So then after we got these habitats set up, we had got onto our main task of seeing, well, what are these habitats like for pollinators? Does it matter if we went through all these efforts to establish this prairie? Are there more bee species? So people sample bee species in a number of ways, but some of the most common ways we employed here. So the first thing that we did was plant observations. So what I'm doing here, I've got my cell phone in one hand to use as a timer, and this is a handheld vacuum with a cartridge that collects the bees. And so we figured out 1 meter square blooming areas of each plant that was blooming in these habitats. And we observed it for 5 minutes. Anything that we caught or anything that landed on it, we collected. We also did a passive sampling using these pan traps that have soapy water. We put these out for 24 hours and they mimic flowers. So the pollinators fall in the cups. We collect them, pin them, and identify them. So after we did that, after we were able to make our collection of bees and identify how many bees and what species of bees were present in each of the different treatments we had in the Cleveland Pocket Prairie Project, we were able to ask our question, you know, is vacant land valuable habitat for bees, and how does management affect its value? So one of the first questions we wanted to ask is, does the mowing frequency affect the number of bees and the abundance of bees that we find in these sites? So to do this, we compared the species richness of the control lots that were mown once a month with a meadow that was mown once a year. And our prediction was that the meadow would have a greater bee species richness and abundance because it had less mowing disturbance. But actually, we found the opposite to that. Control lots had a higher bee species richness than the meadow. And we believe this is because mowing once a month actually promoted bloom of the early spontaneous vegetation. And what I'm showing these pictures was commonplace. When you would go to the meadow sites, yes, they had flowers, but they had a lot of grass. They became very grass dominated. And so they did not have as many resources for the bees. So meadow, not good for bees. The other thing is people really hated the meadow treatment pretty consistently. It looked messy. It did not meet their expectations for urban green space. And they didn't see beauty in it because it did not have a lot of flowers. And so we received a lot of calls on the meadow treatment. So I would not recommend this sort of habitat as a conservation space within an urban area based on what we found. So now if we return to our control vacant lot that was mown once a month, when I tell people that mowing frequency actually increased bee richness, people will say, well, what about weekly? Then the vacant lots could look really kept up, and that would be great because we like turf grass. And so there is going to be a tipping point where increased mowing frequency is no longer going to support insect abundance, right? Because you can see in the picture of the mown monthly that there's a ton of blooming vegetation that would not be there if we were mowing weekly. So this would not be good. So my conservation takeaway here is that a lazy lawnmower approach, which is commonly used to refer to mowing, maybe every 3 to 4 weeks in vacant lots, really does promote both blooms and bees within cities. So next we wanted to see, okay, so that's good. The control lot is valuable, but what happens when we plant these other habitats that have been promoted to support bees within cities? So here we're comparing the control lot to the flowering lawn and the pocket prairie and asking the question, does seeding with these flowering habitats increase the number of bee species that a vacant lot can support? And what we found was that there was actually a high number of bees species in all of these habitats. And it wasn't necessarily that a type of flower resulted in more bee species, just the sheer abundance. So vacant lots that had a whole lot of flowers, whether they were native flowers or exotic flowers, supported a higher bee species richness. So here we have this increasing relationship between bee species and bloom abundance. So whether they were native pocket prairie flowers or weedy flowers in a control lot, it really was the amount of resource that mattered. So my takeaway here is that it's the number of flowers, not the type. So they could be weeds, exotic planted flowers, or native planted flowers that matters most for urban bees. So should we think about this as a disappointment? No, definitely not. Because if you think about 30,000 vacant lots, there's not going to be a scenario where we can manage all of those as pocket prairies. Pocket prairies are really pretty and they make sense in certain areas, but there's a lot of other areas where you want low growing vegetation that's inexpensive to manage. And so seeing that the control lots also have ecological value, I think is really exciting and opens the door to a lot of different strategies for bee management in a city. We also wanted to know something about the health of bees. So it's one thing to use the pan traps and to say, oh, I collected more, under this scenario than that scenario, but you can't say anything about how healthy those bees are when you're pinning them out of those pan traps. For instance, were they near death? Were they able to reproduce? Did they have a reduced lifespan? Was their immune system compromised, or were they really healthy and doing great? And so we also wanted to see whether or not planting these pocket prairies might influence some of those metrics. And so we looked at insect reproduction. And we focused on cavity nesting bees. I talked about in the beginning of the seminar, the different types of bees we find, and that cavity nesting bees go into these small cavities, and inside there, they use either leaves or mud to separate cells. And so what you're seeing here is an X-ray we took from one of these straws. And in here, you have several developing larvae and their pollen provisions. And so we wanted to see, well, do female bees have more offspring? Are they more likely to colonize sites and reproduce if there's native plants versus non-native plants for these cavity nesting bees? So we compared our control lot, our flowering lawn, and our pocket prairie. And this is what we found. So this is the number of native bee larvae that were produced by females in these straws in the control, the flowering lawn, and the pocket prairie. And you can see there's this increase. And we found that the pocket prairie had significantly more native larvae being produced as compared to the control. So here, the pocket prairie did aid bee reproductive success over the other habitats within the study. So my takeaway here is that while all habitats are important for bee foraging, native habitats may offer certain benefits to bee reproductive success and are really important to consider when planning out a bee conservation program within a city for cavity nesting bees in particular. The next thing we wanted to know is, okay, we have a certain number of lots. We realize that native plants are really important for bee reproduction. Well, where do we put these? Where do we invest our resources to provide habitat like this? Does it matter if a vacant lot is a single vacant lot with houses all around it? Or should these habitats be placed in areas where there's a whole lot of vacant lots together? For instance, in this picture, you can see 4 driveways that used to lead to houses. So this is a very large patch. So across the city, you have certain areas where, vacant lots are really concentrated, and other areas where there's maybe just a couple here and there. So does that matter for insects? So to do this, we were able to work with the city of Cleveland to get these really nice landscape data from them. So what you're looking at here in the center of this map is each of our 40 sites. We made these landscape maps. So here at this triangle is a vacant lot. And then at a 1 kilometer distance, we calculated the proportion of habitat that was green space, that was buildings, other impervious surface like roads and parking lots, and other green space like tree canopy cover. So you're seeing kind of 4 colors here, and water. So grass and shrubs is shown in this like light tan color. And then tree cover is the dark green, and the red and gray are buildings and paved surfaces. So in certain cases, the green areas surrounding a vacant lot were fairly connected, meaning the green and yellow areas were connected to one another. And if you look across this map, you can see that there's a large green belt here. There's also several areas with lots of trees along roadways and so forth. Now here is another vacant lot that's in a very isolated habitat, where mostly surrounding that vacant lot, there are buildings and paved surfaces. And a mile or a kilometer is about 0.62 miles, just to orient folks here. So we compared bee richness in vacant lots in those connected landscapes with bee richness in the isolated ones. And what we found was that the landscape connectivity was very important in predicting the value of a vacant lot for insects. So vacant lots that were surrounded by connected green space, as shown here, had a higher bee species richness, had a larger proportion of smaller bees. And we think that is because smaller bees are limited by their dispersal capacity. And so if the vacant lot is not surrounded by other connected green space, they may not be able to colonize it. And the native bees also had greater reproductive success. So in addition to the pocket prairies being important for reproductive success, the connectivity of the landscape also was. So if you were going to put in a pocket prairie, it would make more sense from a conservation standpoint to put it in a landscape that looked like this rather than a landscape that looked like this. So our takeaway here is that we should target areas with high vacancy or nearby parks or large green spaces when installing expensive habitats like a pocket prairie that we're going to have to invest money to install, and also time and money into managing it, because that's where you're going to see the best benefit for bees. So my final project here that I want to talk about is the history of Cleveland. So when we look at Cleveland today, there is some industrial activity occurring, but not as much as there was in its heyday, in the height of its population. So back when Cleveland was an industrial center, it was a leader in iron and steel production. But now it is a post-industrial city that still does some steel production, but also has a lot of abandoned infrastructure that formerly was a major source of its manufacturing, and also, unfortunately, has left a legacy of heavy metal contamination among certain parts of the downtown and inner city neighborhoods. And so this represents a challenge, because when we go out and sample bee provisions in these areas, we find heavy metals. So we've done analyses of the provisions that are collected by bumblebees that live in Cleveland versus those that live in the Cleveland suburbs and rural areas of surrounding counties. And the bees that live in Cleveland have detectable concentrations of lead in their provisions, so the pollen and nectar that they collect. So these are samples that we've analyzed of bumblebee queens and workers and provisions for heavy metals. And so our question was, well, yes, they have lead. If you sampled my blood, it probably has some lead in it. Does that have a consequence for bee health? We don't know, right? So we wanted to find that out. So just because they have these contaminants doesn't necessarily mean it's leading to some consequence like poor reproductive success or reduced longevity, but it's a possibility. And so we wanted to measure that. So my student, this was all done in the field. My student wanted to measure this in a controlled environment where we could assess the bee health consequences of just lead exposure, taking away all other factors that could influence bee health. So she set up tents on our research farm and put bumblebee hives in each tent. And some of the tents were just fed sugar water. Some of them were just fed sugar water with the concentration of lead we found in the provision of the bees from Cleveland. And then she also tested several other heavy metals that we also detected in the bees in Cleveland. And we used the same concentrations that we found in the provisions in the field in these nectar solutions. And when we were making these nectar solutions, it was an extremely small amount of heavy metal that we needed to create the concentration. And I really thought in my mind, like, probably this is not going to have an effect on these bees, but we've got to test it because this is what we're finding in the field. And I thought, well, if we don't, we'll test higher levels, because in Superfund sites and certain sites, you do see higher levels. And so she can assess that. So we were really surprised to see that even those low concentrations that we found in Cleveland did have a negative impact on bee health in these tents. So she measured the health of the brood that the bumblebees had in their hives. And so in a control hive that was just fed sugar water, after 15 days of exposure, she collected the hive, froze it, and then counted the number of healthy larvae and dead larvae that were in the hive. And it was very obvious, because this is a healthy larva here and this is a dead one. So you could easily count, which ones were alive and dead. So about 20% of the bee larvae, for whatever reason, were dead in the control colony. But unfortunately, when the bees were exposed to any one of these heavy metals on their own, you had 3 to 4 times the brood mortality. And when they were fed field level concentrations of all of the heavy metals in their nectar, which is pretty common in the samples that we had in the city, often when a site is contaminated with one heavy metal, you also find higher concentrations of other metals. We had about 9 times the mortality. So this is an alarming fact that we need to investigate and figure out how to remediate. So our conservation takeaway here is that before selecting your site, it's very important to soil test. And I would soil test the site that you're going to install the habitat on, as well as some surrounding habitats where bees might also visit flowers. and avoid sites with heavy metal contamination. So taking all of this together, how can communities approach urban bee conservation? So first of all, I want to focus on the fact that these habitats are occurring within neighborhoods where you have a lot of people living and working. And so engaging neighbors in conservation plans from the get-go and figuring out what their goals are for a habitat is really, really critical to the success of the habitat long-term. So often, we may have certain aesthetic preferences as conservation practitioners that may not align with those that are held by neighbors. And one thing that a lot of people do not like is tall vegetation, which makes the pocket prairie angle challenging. And pocket prairies may not be right, or they aren't right for all sites because they're not going to fit in with what people want for their neighborhood. They can be great in certain scenarios, but it's important to assess this before you put a lot of time and energy into planting a pocket prairie. So this is a picture of a news story. Residents of the east side want Cleveland to mow the grass and say it's too high. This is something that happens every spring. We get a lot of rain. It's hard for the city to get in and mow. They might have to push that monthly schedule back a few more weeks. The sites get really tall. People start to get upset. Also, when you go to install habitat for bees, this is not going to be universally accepted, right? So you have to figure out, is there a site where we are not going to raise alarm because we're creating habitat for something that some people are fearful of? Or can we engage people in an educational program where we talk about the actual versus perceived risks of doing something like this, and provide people with the information they need to not be fearful of the outcomes of the conservation planting. Also very important. You don't want to just go out there and put a sign, this habitat is now for bees, and people are like, what? I didn't sign up on this. I don't want bees. And so we need to co-create with the community, the city, and with a community of scientists if we actually want to balance this teeter-totter, right? And provide both people and bees with what they need. And throughout this presentation, I've focused on some conservation takeaways of design, landscape, and pollution. So now I want to focus on some considerations in terms of management to meet community expectations. So one major challenge of creating these habitats is that it's really expensive to meet the standard of a really nice looking park habitat. So if we think about what someone might want in a flowering green space, probably most people would think that the habitat here is meeting their expectations for both insects and people. It's got a lot of flowers for the insects. It's also beautiful. The challenge is, how do you do that in a municipal environment that has very low tax base to invest in conservation? And we're doing most of the work with volunteers, and it's very challenging. And so you may seek to try to mimic some of the elements that are in this picture with your conservation planting. And these elements that indicate care are often referred to as cues to care. And this was coined by Joan Nassauer in her work, examining how landscape design can influence how people view that and benefit from that landscape. So things that are involved in cues to care can be clean edges, lots of colorful, beautiful flowering habitat, mowed grass, signage, mulching, fencing, lots of elements that you would think of in a nice park environment. Litter removal. The challenge is actually implementing these in a pocket prairie vacant lot scenario. So, here's the ideal. This is our attempt at the ideal with a limited budget. And we had a pretty high budget even to do this. So we've nailed it on the flowering plant abundance, but our plants are tall. There is some weeds there. We attempted to create a border by mowing a border around the site. We also wanted to add a fence, but with the city permit costs, our fence went from a fence to this front-facing fence. We also mulched the front of the site. But we ran into a lot of challenges in that we didn't necessarily meet the aesthetic the aesthetic needs of the community through our habitats. As I mentioned a few times, there were weeds in the habitats, which caused people to want me to spot herbicide, which really was not possible, or pull weeds, which would not be possible if you're trying to manage these at a large scale. Also, even though we had the mowed fronts and the mulching, pocket prairies don't bloom year round. So in the early spring, when the plants were just tall, they appeared to be an overgrown field to folks, and we got a lot of phone calls to cut them. We also ran in a lot to people who did not want tall, messy looking vegetation. There was a real desire to have very orderly flowering plants in many of the areas that we worked. And this is very common in any kind of urban environment. People want their gardens to look neat and tidy. In fact, some people even would plant fake flowers because you never have to worry about weeds or keeping things up this way. And so if your aesthetic is to have very neat and tidy flowers with open soil and no competing weedy vegetation, it's going to be almost impossible to meet these expectations through planting a pocket prairie. We also had troubles with vandalism and dumping. So even neighbors that were on board with the project would get frustrated when they would go out and see our signs down, or our signs ripped apart, or debris such as mattresses, tires, and things in the sites. And so we combated this struggle by doing constant cleanup. Every week we go to the sites and remove bags and bags of garbage. So this is a standard week of garbage in the back of my van. We also did large cleanup of debris as it would occur. So you would go out to sample and there would be a mattress. We'd have to get a truck and get rid of the mattress. We did tire removals once a year, and once a year I also would rent a dump truck to get everything that people dumped during the winter. One of the big problems we had was construction companies coming in from the suburbs in winter and dumping sheetrock and shingles and all kinds of stuff in these sites, old plywood. And so if you're going to do something like this, I think fencing, making sure you have local people keeping, on top of it is really important to prevent this kind of stuff. One time I was out in the site and a tire company from the Northeast Ohio suburbs had pulled up a flatbed and they were dumping tires, rolling them into the site while I was there. And I went out and said like, hey, I'm actually here. And so then they quickly, took off, but it's a big problem. We also had troubles finding good contractors. So I had 3 contractors over the years I had to let go because they did not keep up the habitats to my standards. They would say things like, well, it looks better than the rest of the vacant lots. Whereas we were trying to meet that park aesthetic, right? Like we were trying to really make this look better. So they would do things like not mowing straight edges. Well, it's not going to look like a clean border if it's not straight. In this case, people went right through the site and mowed the vegetation in the late fall instead of mowing a border. So I finally got fed up and bought my own equipment to mow, edge, and manage these sites. And so if you're going to do something like this, I would highly suggest owning your own equipment and investing in your budget enough to have staff to be able to care for these sites, because you need to be able to deal with a complaint right away. If someone calls and says there's a mattress or the tree lawn needs to be mowed, you need to be out there that day doing it. And with contractors, I was never able to get people that were that responsive. One of the most challenging things to sort when you're doing urban conservation is perceived and actual crime risk associated with green space. So while we think of green space oftentimes as a benefit, people can also see it as a risky environment. Especially if the vegetation is tall or dense, or there's obstacles blocking your view like trees. So this is a site that's on a corner of a pretty busy street, and there's a bus stop over here. You can just see the little bit of the house of the bus stop here. There's a gas station behind the site. This is an example of a poorly placed green space on my part, where I didn't think about the surroundings when I put this pocket prairie here. So someone called and complained because they were afraid to walk to the bus stop that's over here, because she thought that there might be someone hiding in the plants and she could get robbed, or worse, because they would run out early in the morning and attack her when she was going by. So the same site had hosted a field day for kids a couple weeks prior to me getting this email. So this is my grad student, Denisha, standing here with a net We have kids from the surrounding area that were collecting insects, and you can see that all of them are above the height of the vegetation. So while it was tall, it was not that tall, and you could see in there. And if someone was in there, I think that you would see them, but it doesn't really matter if I think that she could have seen them. If someone perceives that as a safety risk, you really need to deal with it straight away. And so we ended up having to remove this site because it was poorly placed. So this is another thing to think about. And not only is that a perceived risk, but someone unfortunately had been shot and killed in the local area. And that's the picture here, this memorial. And so, this person had real fears that this person, whoever did this, perpetrated this crime, could be, in the area and could represent a risk. So again, working with neighborhoods to figure out where to place conservation habitats is just as important as figuring out ecologically where to place conservation habitats. So my takeaways here is everyone's opinion matters. I hear a lot from people who are passionate about conservation that say things like, well, people just don't know. And so if they knew, then they would care, or they'll figure it out, once I plant the planting. And that's really the wrong take. You have to bring people along, and you have to value their opinions just as much as you value your own opinions, and work together to find a lasting solution. There are many ways to support bee health. Bees are pretty flexible. So if people aren't maybe as flexible, think creatively about how you can change your design to meet the needs of the community. Build a team. That team should consist of local city leaders, neighbors, maybe some business owners in the area. You want a lot of people advocating for the project and working together to make it a success. Do not establish a site and then ask people to accept it. Build it with them. Also, and this is critical for the long-term success, you want a budget for a long-term management of the habitat. You're going to need to respond to complaints quickly, as I said. And if you start your project on a grant, if the grant ends in 3 years, you're going to need a long-term funding plan to be able to keep it going. So I would really thank everyone for being here today. I'll be happy, to answer any questions. I want to thank all of the residents that we worked with in Cleveland, as well as our city partners and our funding sources. And thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Mary, for an excellent presentation. I love hearing about your research, and you were an excellent extension practitioner even before this research project started, but I really think it's fascinating to watch how your perspective has really deepened over the time of this project, and kind of looking more at the needs of the community and being really responsive to that. I think it's really a key to extension, so kudos to you.
Thank you.
I love the plastic flowers too. I think that's awesome.
I always put that in because one woman who really did not like our plantings at all had all fake flowers. And it just made me realize that you're not going to get, everybody's not going to come to a consensus, but I think there's a lot of room for us to work together for sure.
Okay, so we have a couple categories of questions. So let me try to ask them this way. So there are several questions around mowing and kind of what the mowing heights were. So maybe you could talk about that, what height the city mowed at, what your mowing rate height was, and then what your once a year kind of practice was.
Good questions. So the city cuts with a brush mower. So these are higher than you're going to see in a standard residential lot. So we're talking about an 8-inch mowing height. That's not something you can really accomplish with a traditional deck of a mower. So I had a brush mower that we used to mow the lots to kind of mimic what they were doing. With our plots at the end of the season, we cut those with, Davy Tree Company brought in a brush mower and cut those for me.
Okay.
So that's, again, not something, it's tall. You would not be able to chop it down with a standard mower.
Okay. And with that annual mowing, there was a question about why you decided to do that in October versus in April.
Good question. So part of it was complaints. So in the fall, plants turn brown. They are tall. There's a lot of resources there, like seeds for birds, overwintering habitat. And so if I had this in my own yard, in a rural area, or other area where that might work, I probably would cut it in the spring. but we had to cut it in the fall because it just represented a real nuisance to people. And also in Cleveland, sometimes the snow lingers, and I was concerned that we wouldn't be able to get in and cut it before we were damaging, plants coming up, which some of these plants are coming up in April. So there was also some ecological concern. We felt like October would work best.
Great, thanks. So there are also a group of questions around how you prepped the sites. So one question was whether you felt the use of herbicides and tilling might be harmful to bees that were already on the site.
So this was a research project of 40 vacant lots. It was never meant to be a long-term conservation project so much as a demonstration of what could be. And so because I had to install 40 sites, we had to herbicide them. It was a crew of me and 3 grad students when we started the project. If I was going to advise someone how to do this on a single lot and they didn't want to use herbicide, absolutely. You can put down plastic, you can, to shield out the vegetation, leave that for a couple years, or even 1 year to reduce the herbicide pressure. So this could have definitely had a negative impact on the local habitat, but these sites are 12 by 30 meters or 40 by 100 feet. So it is a small, space. Most bees are flying at a distance far greater than that. And we certainly had a high abundance the next season. So I think, any local mortality that occurred due to the herbicide treatments and tillage quickly rebounded, but certainly there would be an effect on what you're taking out when you do those activities.
There was a question about the use of compost and micronutrients on the sites, and the question was, in hindsight, do you think those additions were necessary?
The native plant producer that we worked with did soil testing and thought that the soil was in need of some compost and micronutrient amendments. He felt that would aid in the establishment of the plant, so we went with it. That wasn't something that we studied. So we didn't, in other words, have a control one where we didn't add that, where we can compare, establishment rates or anything. I would say in your own site, it may or may not be necessary. So I would definitely do the soil testing and talk to an expert to determine if they think that those expenses are needed or not. But you certainly don't want to add them if they're not necessary.
Okay, great, thanks. Folks, if you need to hop off, if you do me the favor of offering a thank you to Mary in the chat box, I know she'd appreciate that. We'll keep recording the rest of, we'll take a few more questions, so you can come back to that recording if you need to hop off for another meeting. Mary, there were a couple questions about providing habitat for nesting sites and whether you did any additions to those sites or whether you felt that there were existing cavities from vacant properties and other structures that provided nesting habitat.
So we did not add any nesting habitat. We put out those trap nests to assess the quality of the habitat for reproduction, and those were the same traps in all of the sites. There are a number of vacant buildings that provide a lot of different habitat for cavity nesting bees. Interestingly, we also found a very high abundance of soil nesting bees in the vacant lots, and typically soil nesting bees show a decline in urban areas. So we thought it was interesting that we found so many species, but we have compared, the total community of soil nesting bees surrounding the city versus what live in Cleveland, and you do see a decline. So some soil nesting bees are just not found within these habitats.
Okay. And speaking of bees, there were a few questions around bees. Did you find native versus non-native species? How did that
I'm not going to remember the exact percent, but over 90% of the species that we found were native bees. Now, in terms of abundance, there were a few very common exotic bees. Our cavity nesting bee community was heavily dominated by exotic bees. That is why we focused on the abundance of native larvae to see what was helping those native bees that nest in cavities. But we do have quite a few non-native cavity nesters that are very common in cities, and they're known to have very general nesting requirements, like they can go in cavities of different sizes and they feed on a lot of different flowers. So it kind of makes sense why they would be able to survive in this scenario.
How about comments on generalist bees versus specialist bees? Did you find some specialists out there?
We did not find too many specialists out there. We have found things like the squash bee and some urban farms we've sampled and things like that. We also didn't sample really early in the spring, where you might find a lot of spring ephemeral specialists, and to see if they occur or not. A lot of this work is done by grad students, or all of this work is done by grad students or undergrads. And so they're getting out of school in May, April, May. And so we often miss that May timeframe of sampling when we might find some of those bees.
Okay, there was a question. I don't know if you mentioned leaf blowers or just this got upvoted. A lot of folks wanted to hear your perspective on, do leaf blowers create a problem for overwintering bumblebee queens?
Okay, so my take on leaf blowers is I cannot stand, like personally, there's a leaf blower going right now and I cannot stand the sound of leaf blowers. It just makes me irate for some reason. So I get whoever said that question, like I'm with you. Now the question is, does it actually have an impact ecologically? I don't know. I have never done any of that work. I have never read any of that work to tell you. I do know that people are looking into this kind of thing. It's hard though, because if I went out and seeded some leaves with, overwintering insects in diapause, it's very hard to create the actual hibernation like scenario that they would create for themselves. Like you can't just put them in the leaves, right? Like they would have specific places that they would go. Maybe if they're in the cocoon stage above ground, that's a little bit easier because their cocoons are attached to plants. It would go in the debris. We could leaf blow it and see what happened. But bumblebees are below ground. So unless you're really out there, disturbing that, they probably should be okay, but it is taking off a layer of insulation. But it's really hard to know what effect that has because it's hard to set that up and then put the treatments of the leaves and then blow them. So I don't know that anyone's done that, but I do not use a leaf blower in my own yard just due to annoyance.
So we can say that Dr. Mary Gardiner does not recommend.
I do not recommend leaf blowers, but it might not be for like scientific reasons.
Great. Let's see. Fran wonders what low-growing flowers were in the lawn mix.
There were 6 low-growing flowers in the lawn mix. I'm gonna have to go back to my slide to make sure I don't give you the wrong information. So the flowers were white yarrow, white clover, English daisy, sweet alyssum, baby blue eyes, and strawberry clover. And that was the fleur de lawn, FLEUR, like floor and flower in French, fleur de lawn seed mix. So if you Google that, it's a product that is commercially available.
Awesome. Maybe somebody can find that link too and pop it in the chat box.
I think the company that sells it is called American Meadows, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Let's finish with a couple questions about heavy metals, which is a really interesting part of your research. Are there any plants that can be planted to remove heavy metals from soil?
There are plants that you can use to phytoremediate, but we're actually going a little bit different route. We're working with Kurtz Brothers, which is a local Ohio company, and the Basta lab, Nick Basta at Ohio State University, who's a soil heavy metal specialist. We're creating some amendments to try to reduce the bioavailability of the metals. And we've been planting plants in the greenhouse and looking at the movement of the metals into the nectar to determine how we best might remediate this. And these aren't, scary or expensive processes. They're using things like ash, and compost and things to add to the soil, which actually change the way those metals can move through it. So it's exciting to me because it's a naturally occurring product, it's low cost, and something that could be implemented at a big scale. So once we get data on which of these amendments is best, and these are ongoing research projects right now, we'll be making some recommendations to cities that are trying to deal with heavy metals. And because these are produced by a local company, they'll be available.
Interesting, really great. So Mary, this is my question. I just wonder what's happening now with those sites. I know your program was really, or your research project was really a 5-year end. Are any of those pocket prairies still going? Are they
They
mowed
are
down?
not. So when I started this project, we obtained a lease from the city of Cleveland that was developed with OSU attorneys and the city to lease these sites for this research demonstration. So these sites were taken on, they were managed by me for that time period. And when my project ended, so did the sites. So those sites have been transferred back to the city. However, cities across Ohio are actively engaged in the development of pocket prairies. So I've worked with people in Cincinnati, in Cleveland, and in Youngstown who have established pocket prairies on vacant lots, different conservation groups. So the data that, and the things that we demonstrated are being taken up, but not the actual sites.
Yeah, I know mowing was a real hassle, and finding somebody I just remember that struggle over the years.
This was $1 million grant that ran this project. It's an incredible amount of input, labor input, and time to manage them. And so, yeah, we couldn't have, if we would have just left them, they would have gotten overgrown and they really would not have been what we wanted them to be.
Sure.
So.
Great. Well, thanks, Mary, so much for a wonderful webinar. Always enjoy learning about you and your great research.